Housing costs are through the roof now.
Because it remains incredibly difficult for the average landowner to build homes. They continue to be sued under all kinds of laws. That's no way to build ourselves out of a housing crisis.
But the state wants to develop, right? They're actually mandating the cities.
In theory, it's great. In practice, I am skeptical it's going to happen.
You put all this housing here, it's gonna be a lot more people. So what are the impact to the local park system? Who pays for that? These are all managed resources. There's a lot of infrastructure conversations that isn't happening around housing that need to happen.
California has the highest average housing cost in the country. While some believe it's due to lack of available housing, others attribute the high cost to government policies. Today, we dive into the factors contributing to this high housing costs. We also discuss the state-mandated housing development initiative and why some cities are fighting back.
It's dangerous what's happening right now in the housing in the cities. We're just being run over.
But it's hard to find a place now. It's become so expensive.
Yeah, it is expensive. And it's not because of a lack of housing, it's a lack of affordable housing. And a lot of this housing that's coming online is not affordable, it's just market rate housing.
Folks who are elected officials or appointed commissioners have a responsibility to Californians to be leading on solutions for this. And I just don't think nothing should ever change as an acceptable solution.
I'm Siyamak. Welcome to California Insider. Jim, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
One of the issues that California is facing is housing. You know, housing costs are through the roof now. And there are different ideas. The state wants to develop a lot of housing, and some cities don't want to develop the housing, and sometimes in their area they're pushed to develop a lot of housing. You've done a lot of research on this. Can you tell us what's happening with the state housing issues?
Well, the state is finally waking up to the fact that we don't have enough housing to meet the supply in this state. I mean, the law of supply and demand is inexorable. You need to have enough housing to meet the demand, and we haven't done that for years. Every year we should be building about 200,000 units, and we build less than half of that anymore in a good year. So the state recognizes there's a problem, and they're trying to implement solutions, although frankly, I'm skeptical that the state is going to succeed if it continues down the path that it's been going down for a long time.
And can you tell us more? Why do you think the state cannot succeed?
Because it remains, and it will remain until we have dramatic changes, incredibly difficult for the average landowner to build homes almost anywhere in California. And if you do get to build homes, you're going to be hit with all sorts of fees and expenses and lawsuits. So, for example, the typical landowner that might want to build some homes in California has to go through the gamut of zoning laws, has to go through lawsuits brought by neighbors, the not in my backyard or NIMBY neighbors. You have environmental lawsuit after environmental lawsuits that are filed sometimes. And then communities adopt fee structures that require home builders to pay between $20,000 and $158,000 per housing unit in fees. So you talk about the lack of affordable housing. I lay the problem at the foot of the government. The government's responsible, and I don't see the government doing all that much to get us out of that mess.
But the state wants to develop, right? They're actually mandating the cities, and the cities have to comply. So you don't think this development will happen? What are your thoughts?
I think in theory, it's great. In practice, I am skeptical it's going to happen. So you have the mandates that are being imposed, and of course cities are resisting them right and left. But even with the mandates, that's not necessarily going to get things built if it doesn't pencil out for a developer to build homes. And there are all kinds of disincentives to building homes in California. You have to face years of litigation and lawsuits, which drives up the expenses. Time is money. And courts and people suing don't seem to understand that if you delay a project by 3 or 4 years, it's much more expensive. And in my book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, I talk about some of these stories where housing projects have been delayed year after year after year, escalating the costs. So even if you get through the cost structure, then you have the fees that are imposed by local and state governments. For housing, if it's built with government money as any part of it, you have to have union project labor. And that's very, very expensive. That raises the cost 30, 40%, depending. And on top of those costs, you have additional costs for essentially buying solar panels to the roof, 10,000 a unit or 10,000 a home. You have to pay good money to affordable housing mandates. So if you build 10 or 20 units, you may have to have 1 or 2 of those units as affordable, which means the people buying the new units have to subsidize these things, these new units, these new homes. And those kind of things are just one cost after another that if I were a developer, I would look at the costs, I'd look at the difficulties in California and say, hey, Texas and Florida are much friendlier. Why don't I just go there and I can actually make a living rather than just getting ulcers from dealing with the government bureaucracy?
We're covering California issues, as you know. If you want us to cover the stories that are impacting your day-to-day life in California, reach out to me at siyamak@californiainsider.com. As the state has been asking these cities to build, do you think these projects that are going to be built in these cities, because we're hearing from some mayors that they're facing challenges, they have to build thousands of affordable units. Do you think they're going to face the same challenges as other projects in the past, the same type of lawsuits, the same type of issues? Fees?
Absolutely. California is famous for its anti-development mindset. And that mindset hasn't gone away. Now, yes, more people recognize the harms that that mindset has caused in the lack of affordability of housing, which has spilled over into the housing crisis onto our streets. But still, people don't want new developments in their backyard. And that's a problem. Communities should embrace housing for working people. Communities should embrace the sort of duplexes and triplexes and multifamily housing that would enable people who work in a community to actually live in that community. But there are too many people that are just simply opposed to development at all costs and will sue for any reason or no reason at all simply to stop the development.
And in terms of suing, is anybody can sue based on what you have researched?
Under the California Environmental Quality Act, pretty much anybody can sue. Every project that of any significant size, more than 1 or 2 homes, has to go through an environmental review process. And you can always find something that should have or could have been discussed. Right now, you have to discuss 100 different things in your environmental reports, if it's of any significance at all. And anybody can find, well, I can nitpick there, I can find something you should have done there, I don't agree with your numbers there, and you file a lawsuit. And the lawsuit can take years. In my book, Nowhere to Live, I talk about stories of developments in Southern California where after agreeing to give away a couple 100,000 acres in a very large project for conservation, they continued to be sued under the environmental laws, under habitat conservation laws, under all kinds of laws. And these lawsuits have been going on now for 20 years. That's no way to build ourselves out of a housing crisis.
Jim, we have talked to a lot of mayors, and some of them argue that their cities are already built out. And when they are mandated to build more, they just don't have the space. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, other cities prove that's not to be true, because you can take a city which has a lot of single-family housing, and pretty much every city does, and you can start to allow the conversion of those single-family lots into duplexes and triplexes. Houston is an example which does not have zoning, but is very built out, but it continues to build more from inside out. Density can increase. That is the traditional ways that housing used to be developed in this country before we have our restrictive zoning laws adopted. It used to be that a city or a community would be very low density, and over time density increases, low density out in the outlying areas, such as the suburbs, and eventually the city grows. So, I don't think that's a good excuse to say that we are built out, we can't do anything more. Yes, you can do more if you allow it to happen.
Now, some people say our residents, when they bought this area, when they bought into this city and this community, they bought because they were a promise for them to buy in a single-family neighborhood. And now, if the cities come and change their allowing other people to develop, they're kind of letting go of that promise, and this city will change.
There is really nothing to the idea that there is some kind of legal promise to have the zoning stay the same forever. We usually see that in the context of downzoning, where property may be zoned for a while, half-acre minimum lot sizes, and then the city will increase it to 1-acre minimum lot sizes, on up to, in Marin County and other areas, 160-acre minimum lot sizes. So zoning can change both ways, upzoning and downzoning. And people living in a community don't necessarily have the right to maintain the status quo. Now, what they can do through homeowners associations, they can enter into contractual agreements to maintain the neighborhood the way it is. Houston has this going on, these neighborhood agreements, but they have a date of 20 years where people get to renegotiate, because they may realize that, you know, if I can take my single-family home and convert that into a duplex or a triplex, my home is going to be a lot more valuable. And my neighbor's homes can be a lot more valuable because the property can be used for those purposes. So sometimes it's a lack of creative thinking on the part of homeowners, but most importantly, I believe that we should not be trying to exclude people that are simply, you know, working class people, poorer people, minorities who need a place to live. And some of this large lot exclusionary zoning does exactly that, and that just isn't right.
Some of the people we have talked to, they say when you do that, when you allow people to build more on a piece of land, you actually increase the value of that land, and you will make it more expensive for others, for new buyers.
So it's the concern about gentrification. When you take a relatively rundown neighborhood and people move into that and they improve it and fix it up, and then it becomes less affordable for people that are there. And that is a legitimate problem. But the reason why, you have to think about the underlying reason why people with more money move into depressed or lower echelon neighborhoods, and that's because those are often the only places left to build. As long as it's so incredibly difficult to build throughout California, people are going to be going for the lowest hanging fruit. And that lowest hanging fruit is areas that are subject to gentrification. So I have a great deal of sympathy for people who may lose out on gentrification. Yes, their properties may be more valuable, but if they're renters, they may no longer be able to afford to live in a neighborhood. The answer is to allow a lot more building to occur to put less pressure on those areas that would otherwise be subject to gentrification.
And now in terms of building, what are your thoughts on building areas outside of the areas that are built out?
I think it's absolutely necessary to have the volume of housing that we need. We have to go into what is called greenfield development. That is, areas that are not now used for housing or other commercial uses. And so, yeah, we're going to have to build in areas that are not already built out. But that is what we have been doing in California ever since California's been around. And yeah, I like the open spaces, but we can't afford the open spaces, or put another way, our love with open spaces is causing people to be camping out on the streets in major cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles because prices are so darn high for housing. And so, yeah, open space is nice, but when you talk about, do we want habitat or do you want people able to afford homes other than the sidewalks? I think we have to draw a balance, and the right kind of development outside of already developed areas can make a lot of sense. If it's done right, it can be done. And it makes actually environmentally more sense to do it here in California, which has such a temperate climate. People living here have a lower carbon impact because they don't need as much heating or cooling as they do in other parts of the country. And so we can develop homes in California that are going to be an environmental net benefit, rather than forcing people to move to other states like Idaho, which has huge heating bills, or the desert of Arizona, or whatever. So we could be smarter than we are about this, and simply saying no new development in undeveloped areas is not a smart way of proceeding.
Now, Jim, was there a time that you decided to look into this? Did something motivate you?
I have been litigating property right cases for 40 years, representing pro bono with Pacific Legal Foundation landowners that are trying to make use of their property, who have run into all kinds of environmental restrictions, lawsuits, all kinds of difficulties in trying to build the homes near where people want to buy them and live in them. And it came to me that these lawsuits after lawsuits that I've been involved in are all serving to restrict the supply of housing. And it became really apparent to me that our tremendous shortfall in housing development in California and other states is a direct consequence of our failure to respect the right of people to use their property and to use their property rights in a way that meets the demand that people have for new housing. So after litigating these cases for 40 years, I thought it was really time to put my experience and thoughts to paper, and so I wrote Nowhere to Live, this hidden story of America's housing crisis, to talk about how we got into the mess we are today and hopefully how we can get out of it.
You've been involved with a lot of cases, right?
Right.
Can you tell us some of the things you have seen that people should know about?
Well, I would like to talk about our most recent victory that Pacific Legal Foundation had at the Supreme Court. George Sheets was a 73-year-old man, and with his wife and grandson, he wanted to put down a 1,858 square foot manufactured home on 10 acres of property in rural El Dorado County, which is just east of Sacramento. And the county told him, well, yes, you can have a permit to put a manufactured home on your 10 acres, but you have to pay to the county $23,400 for traffic impact fees. And George, he said, traffic impact fees? I don't have that kind of impact on traffic. And the county said, well, yes, you do, and that includes about 10% of that is to improve a highway interchange for Interstate 50, which is about 5 miles by road from his house. And the California courts upheld that. We took that case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with us that El Dorado County can't force somebody to pay that kind of money for a development fee, for a transportation impact fee, unless the county can prove that the development is going to cause that kind of impact. And we don't think we can, or we don't think the county can. So that is just one of our most recent cases. I argued a case at the Supreme Court representing Anthony Palazzolo. He was a retired tow truck driver and junkyard operator. He had about 18 acres on the Rhode Island coast, and the state was not allowing him to develop the property, and the state would not even allow him to bring a suit arguing that the state has taken his property. So I argued the case and said, look, he's owned this property for 20 years in one form or another. He should have a right to sue to argue that the state has taken his property if they won't let him develop that. And we won that case as well. So we've had a number of cases, but the common thread of all of our cases is we're representing people pro bono who are just up against government bureaucracy, up against government fiat, up against, in a sense, government abuse, not allowing people to exercise their property rights in the way that are guaranteed, in the way that is guaranteed by the Constitution.
If you like California Insider and you like to know what's going on in California, make sure to check out Epoch Times. This is a newspaper that started by a group of Chinese Americans because of human rights abuses in China, and now is starting to grow here. Make sure to go to the Epoch Times website and check out the California section, where you can get a lot of fresh perspectives on what's going on in California. Now let's go back to the interview. If we look at the California cost of housing, it's around double the national average. How much of it do you think is the cost of lawsuits?
I think a significant part of it is not so much the cost of lawsuits and attorneys, but the cost of delay and the disincentive that is given to people to want to build houses in California. Because if you want to build, you have to realize you are going to face lawsuits if you have any significant project at all. Those projects are going to take years and years more time to develop in California because of the lawsuits than it would be in another state. So the cost of the delay, the cost of the attorneys, and the uncertainty. Maybe you're going to lose those lawsuits and you can't develop your property. And that can certainly happen because if you cross a T the wrong way or dot the I the wrong way on an environmental impact report, you may lose a lawsuit and you have to start over from scratch, from square one. And that's something I talk about a lot in my book, Nowhere to Live, of the lawsuits and the delays that are caused. So yeah, I think the significant price of housing in California being higher than it is elsewhere, a large part of that is due to the environmental lawsuits.
Why does it cost a lot more to delay a project? Can you explain that?
Well, a developer may have a certain amount of money borrowed from the bank at interest rates of, going interest rates, 3, 5, 7, 10%, whatever the, interest rates are at the time. And every year that you delay being able to build a project, the developer has ongoing costs to pay for the land and with no return coming in. A developer makes money by usually borrowing money, buying land, building homes, selling the homes, and getting a return on the investment. But that's incredibly difficult to do in California. So a developer is going to have to build into the price of the housing a significant increase to make up for the potential of lost time. Time is money when it comes to investment, and that's what developers face here in California.
Now, Jim, you've been in it for 40 years, right? Now, have you thought about any solutions?
Absolutely. The first part of the solution, and there are no easy answers. There's no panacea, snap your fingers and it's going to be taken care of. But the first part of the solution is to recognize the problem we're in and how we got there. And my thesis is that it's our lack of respect for property rights and the lack of respect for the ability of people to build homes near where people want to live. Recognize that problem, and then what do we do with it? We deal with that by allowing more homes to be built, by looking at some of the exclusionary zoning policies we have in California and really tamping those down to make sure that communities allow more duplexes, triplexes, other multifamily, depending what's appropriate for an area. But more than we have today has to be built. We have to, second of all, reform the litigation process. It cannot be that anybody can sue to stop a project, one lawsuit after another. The California Environmental Quality Act has to be reformed. We have to stop some of the other abuses that we see, the imposition of huge fees. As I said earlier, $20,000 to $158,000 per housing unit in California. That has just got to be reformed. Otherwise, the costs are going to keep on going up. We have to deal with all the mandates that we have on housing, whether it's the parking that needs to be required for housing, whether it's the size of the home that's being required, whether it's solar roofs. We have to look very hard at what we are forcing people to actually build. My first house was a small, tiny house, 900 square feet for a young person starting out, and my wife at the time. It was perfect. We don't need to have some of the mandates we have. So there are a lot of solutions, but first of all, we have to recognize the problem is us by preventing the construction of enough new housing.
Do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I think it comes down to me as a bottom line. In Ezekiel and Matthew, Jesus repeats this, you have to love thy neighbor. And thy neighbor is not just the person living in the suburban development next to me, not the person who looks like me and has my income. My neighbor is everybody in California, whether that is a working class person, a minority person, or somebody living on the streets. And by not allowing enough housing to be built for all Californians, and I mean all Californians, we are really not doing our moral duty to our fellow citizens and to our fellow human beings. So, love thy neighbor, allow thy neighbor to be thy neighbor. That is my bottom line.
Jim Berling, Vice President of Legal Affairs at Pacific Legal Foundation. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Very good to be with you.
Nils, you're a city council member of Redondo Beach,
Yep.
and you guys, your city is mandated to build housing because
Yep.
the state needs housing because of affordability reasons. Can you tell us what's the situation for your city?
Yeah, so it's complex. Housing is a very complex subject, and I can break it down very simply. When I got elected in 2017, we were in our 5th cycle of RHNA, regional, in a sense, of regional housing needs allocation. It's basically this really big number that was given out by the state and brought down to different areas, jurisdictions, and then every city had to zone for that. And one of the reasons why I got involved was because when I looked at this number, it was around 1,300, 1,400. I asked a simple question was, well, we were assigned this number. How did we push back on it? How did we get this number? And the answer that came back was city staff just accepted it for what it was. Now in 2024, we have a RHNA number that was 2,400, 2,300 right in there. And the game has changed. The state has now come through and said, you have to zone for that, plus 10%, plus there's affordability requirements in there, so density requirements, affordable housing and highly affordable housing. And when it comes to RHNA and it comes to housing, the state is now making mandates, and if you don't follow them, they just flat out take over your zoning. And if you don't comply, certain rules now come into play, like builder's remedy, which take over a landowner can now just submit a project and force the acceptance of that project. It's dangerous what's happening right now in RHNA and housing in the cities. We're just being run over in Redondo Beach. And while we've been fighting back, we've been successful on some fronts, unsuccessful on others. We've held our ground, and I think we made a big leap forward in defending cities' rights in local zoning.
Now, some people might wonder, why is it dangerous if a developer comes and wants to build, and why don't you guys give the permit to people to build? From your perspective, why is it dangerous?
Yeah, it's a great question. Why is it dangerous? Why can't somebody just own a piece of parcel and just do whatever they want with it, right? And it's one of the things I've really come around on and had to self-reflect on. You know, I came into council, and before I was even really involved, I thought, well, if you own a piece of property, you kind of do whatever you want with it. But since then, I've really realized a piece of parcel is you're given rights when you buy a piece of property by the community, and they've zoned it as such. And there's a multitude of different reasons for that. You don't have single-family housing next to a rock crushing facility. And I use this example all the time. If I own a single-family house and somebody next door to me buys a single-family house and they convert that to a rock crushing facility, that's an incompatible use. My housing value will go down. I will not be able to move forward. So if I own a single-family house, single-family neighborhood, and the house next door, someone buys it and says, I want to build a 5-story apartment building, that's incompatible. And it's incompatible on a multitude of different reasons. For instance, sewer line systems, right? Sewer lines are as a community-based, city-based upgrade. So if your sewer lines are based for 100,000 people, but now you suddenly have 200,000 people, who pays for those upgrades? What do you do about parking? Are you gonna just dump all your parking onto the streets? Well, the streets are managed as a public resource. Does that mean anyone can just park there and use that as a public resource? Or do you keep those impacts within the scope of that parcel, right? The 4 squares of that parcel. What about electricity and light and traffic? Do you just simply allow somebody to do whatever they want with that parcel? Or do you have a certain set of rules for neighborhood compatibility? We have a developer's remedy project, a power plant site in Redondo. It's been a power plant for over 100 years. There used to be an old wetlands there. So the Coastal Commission says 6 acres shall be returned back to wetlands. And it's been fought over, this parcel, for 30 or 40 years now as to what the future of it is. No one wanted it. It's a big, ugly, hulking structure and multiple different areas of it. And the power plant company has threatened multiple times to do a new power plant, to repower. And the community has just chosen, we have a city charter that says any major allowable land use changes shall go to a vote of the people. And that's in there because when you change the use somewhere, and in a major land use change hits certain thresholds, the residents get to decide whether those impacts are worth it. And in 2012, the residents voted, actually earlier than that, voted to move this parcel into park, and 50 acres. And so with a conditional use for utility. So it's remained as such. And now someone's come in and said, hey, I own this. This alleged owner has come in. I use alleged because it's in foreclosure. And he says, I can just turn this parcel now into 2,700 residential units plus commercial plus hotel. Now I ask a very simple question. Where are the sewer upgrades? Where is the traffic upgrades? How is the inflow and outflow? What's the impact to the parks, to the schools? You put all this housing here, it's gonna be a lot more people, a minimum of 2,700 people, probably double, right? So what are the impact to the local park system? Who pays for that? These are all managed resources that the city has managed. They're available. And if somebody now comes in and just takes advantage of those resources without paying for the impact of those resources, well, you've just thrown all the management of that resources for the last 50, 100 years that Redondo Beach has had. So does that developer, does that owner get to just take advantage of these public resources that have been well managed over the years and available to all, especially in this particular parcel which in the coastal zone? We have the Coastal Act protecting the coastal access. I say no. It's very simple. Absolutely not. The public has a right to park on public streets. It's not a private parking lot. The sewer systems, if they're built for a certain capacity and you now upgrade your density, someone has to pay for that. Who does? The landowner has to pay for it. Or the community as a whole has to pay for it through a bond. And we did that back in the 70s or 80s. 70s, I believe it was. But we haven't upgraded since. So there's a lot of infrastructure conversations that isn't happening around housing that need to happen around housing and zoning.
Now, you guys are mandated by the state to build around 23 to 2,400 homes. Is it possible for you guys to zone it?
It's a fantastic question. Is it possible for us to zone? Hey, we can zone for 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000, right? But what you just asked was build. And there's a big difference between building and zoning. Sure, can we zone for 100,000 or 2,300? You can do anything. Is it compatible with the infrastructure? Absolutely not. So what we've done, it gets nuanced really very, very quickly, but let's just use round numbers here. We were asked to zone for 2,400 units, but the state now requires 10% buffer because they know that if a parcel is zoned for 100 units, the developer might not use a full 100 units, they might use 90, 95. So they add additional 10%, so 110, right? But in addition to that, they have the state mandates affordable clause in there, which is set by density, 30 to 35 units an acre, and then highly affordable, which is around 45 units an acre. And so within that, in order to get that zoning, you now have to upzone certain parcels. And what we ended up with was well over 3,000 net new units. So it's possible to get there. We made it happen. But the problem is we're now taking out our commercial zoning. So like I said before earlier, I might have said this earlier, 20% of Redondo Beach is only commercial industrial zoning. 80% of it is housing. So we're now taking out the remaining commercial, the few percentage points commercial, and putting housing there. The problem with that is when we talk about traffic, we're the ones creating traffic in Rono Beach. We're so dense, we have no jobs in our city. 93% of our commuters go outside our city. Downtown LA, El Segundo, and Torrance. Main 3 job centers for us. So you'll see on PCH, Aviation, all these different streets, an outflow in the morning and an inflow in the evening. So the problem is, how are we gonna solve that? How are we gonna solve the traffic problem? The problem is, very simple, we don't have jobs. The solution is put the jobs back in Redondo Beach. We've already lost a project that would have brought jobs to us. Now they're gonna wanna do housing because of our arena numbers. What your question was, actually, it was build housing. Show me a local jurisdiction in 2023, 2024, 2020 that builds housing. There is none. Local governments don't build housing. We approve projects. We can zone for, like I said, 100,000 units. But if no developer or no parcel owner comes forward with a project, we can't approve anything. So the state doesn't even build anything. In fact, the state took away housing redevelopment agencies back in 2012 during the budget crisis. They never brought that tool back for local jurisdictions to be able to raise funds and provide that housing and help developers go down that path. And what the net effect of that is, we can zone all day long. We're destroying our commercial base. Our residential base is increasing. And what does that affect? That affects our general fund. we have very little revenue as compared to other cities like Culver City or Manhattan Beach in our general fund because we have so much housing. Housing does not pay for your basic general service such as fire, police, public works. It does not. Every study has shown that. Housing does not pay for your general services. Commercial does, and we have very little of that.
How is it not possible for you guys to zone for this housing? You know, like, can you guys, so people say you should densify, right? The state representatives, the ones that they are coming up with these policies, they say, okay, you should densify. Is it not possible to densify?
It's always possible to densify. It's a great question. We are over 11,000 people per square mile in Redondo Beach. People are going to say, I don't know what that means. I get it. Well, in comparison, City of Torrance right next door is around 7,500 people, 5,500 people per square mile. Manhattan Beach is around that same number. We're next to the densest city on the entire California coastline, which is Hermosa Beach. There are over 13,000 people per square mile. Okay, we're right behind them. We're on the same density as Santa Monica. When you go out to people like places like Barstow, they're less than 1,000 people. Inland Empire, they're like 2,000 to 3,000 people per square mile. We're built out. We in Redondo, I challenge anyone to find a more diverse set of housing than Redondo Beach. We have everything from people living on boats to living in multi-million-dollar mansions. And to quickly expand on that in a nutshell, we have people living on houseboats in our harbor, which don't get counted as part of our RENA numbers, right? Then we have pallet shelters or tiny homes for homeless people, right? We're installing another 25 to get 45 units there. We have a Section 8 housing program along our coastline in the entire city of Redondo Beach for housing vouchers. We've got trailer parks. We have a trailer park for trailers, trailer homes. We've got apartments. We've got condos. We've got townhomes. We've got single-family homes. We have the second largest residential building in all of South Bay. We've done our part in housing. We should get a platinum award from the state of California for producing housing. We've been growing at 5% in population, which is faster than LA County has at 3%. And, you know, again, where's our general fund? It's per person, per capita. It's less than Manhattan Beach or Culver City or even Torrance right next door. We're destroying ourselves, and it's a mandates from the state. It's edicts from the state now that's forcing this.
You mentioned cost. You said it's going to cost a lot to build the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Have you guys thought about what that cost is? What's the number, and how will it impact the city?
How much is the number? It's another good question. Like something that does not get talked about. People, who runs the sewer system? The city does, right? It's a product of the city government. We had a wastewater bond years ago. City was built, designed for X amount of people. We're approaching that or way above that in some areas. The only way to fix that is one of two ways. We tax ourselves through a bond and upgrade all of our wastewater systems, or when a new project comes online, we say to that project holder, the impact here is you need to upgrade our sewer system because you're going from no units or 5 units to 100 units. The project that really got me involved actually is a perfect example of that. In 2015, they proposed 180 units on a parcel that was only allowed to be zoned for 148, but they were only building on 3/4 of that parcel. So they ended up with 115 units. Well, there was no prior units on this parcel. It was all commercial, providing great tax base for us. Now it's mixed use with a minimal amount of commercial, way less than was before, and we have 115 units there. They were forced to upgrade the sewer system because it wouldn't handle the wastewater. So the state's not giving us any money with these forced mandates of housing. The county's not giving us any money. We have to rely on projects to pay for those upgrades. And we're going to hit a certain point where this goes into a fund and we're not going to have enough money there to be able to do those projects anymore.
But people that want to live in your community probably are challenged, or even everywhere in California, especially there on the coast. It's hard to find a place now. It's become so expensive.
Yeah, it is expensive, and it's not because of a lack of housing, it's a lack of affordable housing. And a lot of this housing that's coming online is not affordable, it's just market rate housing. And in Redondo, we have, like I said, a housing stock that's very old, but it's a very dense housing stock. We did our part, and we've done our part in housing. And when it comes to affordability, we have a Section 8 housing program in Rono Beach. The problem isn't as much as providing the number of units, it's about providing affordable units. And developers aren't building that. And cities can't force developers to build that. You can have inclusionary housing, which forces them to do that, but it doesn't, in the end of the day, it doesn't solve the problem. The issue of affordability also comes down to, it's a complicated answer, and it really comes down to like interest rates. We've been giving out free money at a federal system. What has that done? You have large investment corporations coming in to cities and buying apartment buildings, buying single family homes, and turning those into rental properties. And we're at 50-50 essentially, 48-52 of renters and homeowners. In a lot of cities, that's starting to switch where you have majority renters. And who owns those housing units? Large institutional investors. And it's becoming more and more of a problem in California. And the other issue with affordability is everyone wants to live by the coastline. This is California. I don't have an air conditioner. I open up the window, turn the fan on. It's great. And you look at density, the densest cities in California are all along the coastline. You go inland, the further you go inland, the less dense. Barstow has less than 1,000 people per square mile, right? And you go along the coastline, like I said, the densest cities are along the coastline. We had over 11,000, Hermosa Beach, 13,000. Now, if Hermosa Beach or Redondo Beach produces a unit housing, how affordable is any of those units, right? I will just simply say this. If density is the answer, then why is New York, Hermosa Beach, San Francisco, Hong Kong, Tokyo, which is some of London, the densest cities in the entire world, right? Hermosa Beach being the densest city along the California coastline, they should have the most extreme affordability because they're so dense, because of their density and the amount of units. So the argument doesn't work as a whole. It doesn't work at all because the more density you have, what ends up happening is the more expensive the housing is. And that's the simple rule that ends up happening. The more density equals higher housing prices.
Nils, do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
In my journey now, through all these years of going through this process, I have met a lot of great people from around the state. And one group I want to talk about is CALI, California Association of Local Elected Officials. They meet every Sunday. Through that, I met another group, actually our former late mayor, Bill Brand, who passed away earlier this year, founded a statewide initiative called Our Neighborhood Voices. And it really comes down to local officials and people who are watching, contacting their local officials, and demanding that we support and everyone supports Our Neighborhood Voices, which is a statewide initiative that returns all the zoning back to a local level, because that's where these decisions should be made, not a centralized government planning up in Sacramento, which is forcing a solution statewide on all cities, regardless of where they are. All of our cities have our individual characters, our communities. We have different problems. We have different communities. Beverly Hills is different than Palos Verdes Estates, which is different than Redondo, which is different than Barstow, which is different than San Francisco, Stockton. I mean, we all have different communities, different groups of people that live there, right? Whether they travel to work 2 hours, whether they live at home, blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs, a retirement community, a local surfing community. I mean, these are all communities that have grown into their own character, and we have the state coming down on top of us and telling us, you shall conform, and that's just no way you do business. And Our Neighborhood Voices, a statewide initiative, will change that, bring all this local zoning, or bring all this housing and zoning back to a local level. And that's where everyone needs to be. I don't care what happens at the federal level. It doesn't affect us. What happens is everything at a local level. So your local city council really affects your day-to-day life every single day. And, I would just say get involved in your local cities, because that's where the action is happening. Supervisor Janice Hahn has always said, whenever I talk to her, all politics is local politics. And whenever you're going to see this, that is the true truth. And get to know who your mayor is, get to know who your local city council is, because they are the decision makers, they are the policy makers, they are the important ones that run every day in your life. And the higher up you go in the food chain, the less you're going to hear from them, and that's going to affect your everyday life. And take a commitment and to reach out and learn and see what's going on at a local level. It's very important, extremely important.
Nils Nehrenheim, City Council member at Redondo Beach. It was great to have you in California Insider.
It was fantastic being here. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Nolan, it's great to have you. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure.
You are very passionate about developing housing, and you were a former city planner. We want to hear from you. The state is mandating for the cities to zone a lot of housing. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So the context here is that California has probably one of the most acute housing shortages in the country, maybe only after Hawaii, right, which has an even more extreme crisis. Many millions of Californians no longer have a path to homeownership. Many spend over a third or half of their income on rent. And then, of course, we have an unprecedented homelessness crisis that has a lot of causes, but at the root of it is simply a shortage of affordable housing. And this shortage is not by accident, but the result of about a century, especially a half century of policies that have made it uniquely hard to build housing in California. In cities and suburbs all across the country, we have zoning rules that make housing altogether illegal to build, or require the housing that is built to be more expensive, or subject new housing proposals to long, difficult, costly review processes, including environmental review processes that just make it so hard to build. And so our philosophy at California YIMBY is we can and should change some of the laws to make that shortage go away. That's going to entail local governments, in many cases, reforming some of these barriers to new housing production.
Now, Nolan, we have talked to some city council members and mayors, and they're very concerned about their city. And their cities have to zone for a lot of homes, especially in the coastal areas, and they're saying their cities are built out. They may have to replace some of the commercial areas that they have, and they don't want to lose jobs and put housing in their place. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, if you survey Californians repeatedly, the most acute problem that folks are wrestling with is housing affordability. And so folks who are elected officials or appointed commissioners have a responsibility to Californians to be leading on solutions for this. And I just don't think nothing should ever change as an acceptable solution. Of course, a lot of people like their neighborhood the way it is, and we can come up with solutions that strike a right balance. But you look around, for example, where I am in Los Angeles and Southern California, and folks say, we don't have any land, but we have, strip malls that in many cases are ending the end of a 50 or 70 year life cycle that could be turned into apartments over shops or small townhouse communities. One of the things we've done very effectively, for example, is allowing California homeowners to build accessory dwelling units or small additional units, maybe in their backyard or their garage or their attic. Those are the types of solutions that don't necessarily change communities in any radical way, but incrementally add the type of housing that our communities need. And, a lot of local governments, I would add, are leading on this. In many cases, local elected officials, they do deal with problems from NIMBYs or not in my backyard advocates who don't ever want anything built. But many more have said these state nudges are actually helpful for me to lead on this issue locally and find those groups in my community who maybe they don't show up at a planning hearing to complain about every new housing project, but they are invested in housing affordability. Those voices that often are just left out of the conversation.
Now, Nolan, some people have told us that in places where it gets urbanized a lot, the cost of housing goes up with it. Places like San Francisco, Manhattan, the places where there is a lot of urbanization, and this will have an adverse effect. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this has causality exactly flipped. We have lots of housing in the places where there's most demand for housing. And in many parts of the country, for example, in Texas and Florida, they're building a lot of new infill housing, and they've achieved affordable housing supply to meet demand find themselves in a crisis, while those that allow markets to address this issue have much more affordability. California for the first time is losing population, and people are not leaving the state because they hate our perfect weather or our mountains and beaches or our great jobs. They're leaving the state because they don't have a path to affordability. And the future of affordability might look like, a 5-story apartment building over shops, or it might look like townhouses, or it might look like duplexes. But when we actually build these things, in many cases, people are very happy to have them, and they don't necessarily disrupt communities in the way that some allege.
Now, do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I would just really stress this is the number one issue increasingly in California, and so many issues are downstream of this. We talk a lot about numbers, right? But again, for the first time, hundreds of thousands of Californians are having to leave the state. And it's easy to think in terms of abstract numbers, but those are people maybe having to leave the community that they grew up in because they can't find an affordable, decent a home or apartment. Those are people who are having to potentially leave friends and loved ones or turn down professional opportunities and having to leave the state. And then in the most extreme cases, of course, many hundreds of thousands of Californians are sleeping in cars or sleeping on the couches of loved ones or living on the street and developing mental and substance abuse problems that make this so much harder to solve. I would just say, of course, there's a lot of things that have to change to get California back on track to affordability, but the absolute bare minimum thing we need to be doing is building the housing that our communities need.
Nolan Gray, Legislative Director at California YIMBY. It was great to have you on California Insider.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.